right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the November 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris. As always, I work on user support and communications for both the South Atlantic and the Southeast Conservation Blueprints. And we host this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month to share the latest updates about the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like you, and highlight exciting science in the world of landscape conservation in our region. So I will ask that you will keep yourselves on mute throughout the presentation. As a heads up, we are recording this web forum. I always do that just for the one or two people who inevitably wanted to come but had some sort of conflict. I will share the slides and the video of this web forum from the calendar event on the South Atlantic LCC website within a couple of days. And if you have trouble finding that or want to share with somebody, just send me an email. I'll get you that link. Here's our usual agenda for the day. I'll start by introducing our speaker, who will present for 30 to 45 minutes on our topic for the month. There'll be time for Q&A and discussion at the end, and then I will wrap up by previewing next month's webinar. We'll skip staff updates today because Rua is going to pretty much share everything that your staff want you to know. So with that, our speaker pretty much needs no introduction. We're hearing from Mordecai, who is the coordinator of both the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints, and I think most of you probably know him well. He's going to be talking about this fall's update to the Southeast Conservation Blueprint and the SECAS goal report, which we update every year. So with that, I'm just going to hand things over to you, Rua, to go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Hillary. So I'm going to be talking about a few of the updates from 2021. We'll talk about Blueprint, we'll talk about the goal report, and we'll also talk about some results from the symposium and that was discussing the relationship between Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy and America the Beautiful and the 30 by 30 initiative too. So I'll hit all of them in a nice little pretty package. So I'll share my screen first. Sharing screen, start at the beginning. Okay, so I'm just going to go through each of them. So let's talk a little bit about the update to this year's update to the goal report. Just a quick reminder about the SECAS goal. It's that 10% or greater improvement in health function and connectivity, southeastern ecosystems by 2060. And then the metrics we track are looking at that 1% improvement every 4 years in those pieces, and also increases in conservation actions within the blueprint. So I'm going to talk about the report we update every year, kind of tracking, are we on track for that 1% improvement? A few high-level things about the goal report. It's now up on the SECAS website, SECAS Southeast, under the goal section. A few things, only 5 of the 17 indicators are declining. Pine and prairie birds are still the most off track of the indicators, although there are some signs of hope. We are starting to see some things like Bachman sparrow in some of the states starting to kind of level off and increase due to a lot of significant grassland work and things that have been going on. But still, our pine and prairie or grassland birds are the ones that are still in trouble the most. Keeping up with sea level rise is going to be tough. I'll talk about that a little bit in one of our new indicators related to salt marsh area. We need to keep our eyes on fire and longleaf. I'm not going to go into too much of the details for this one on longleaf, but this was the first year where fire and longleaf started getting off track for the goal. So we made some huge improvements in the longleaf ecosystem pretty early on. And as things have been growing around the longleaf collaborations, but we're starting to sort of level off in the growth of fire in longleaf. And that's despite some amazing numbers during the pandemic, which is really super amazing to actually have a little bit more fire than last year. But we need to keep our eyes on fire and longleaf and keep pushing. And then the last thing that I will talk about a little bit is some ongoing increases in working lands conservation, which is one of the things we excel at in the South in general. So those are just some broad results from the report. Here's the dashboard view of progress towards achieving the goal so far around health function and connectivity. So you sort of see if we're in that green, we're all good. We're on track for meeting that 1% increase. So this is looking at the recent trends over the last few years. So if we're in the green, cool, we're all good. If we're in the yellow, we're still increasing, which is great, but we're just not quite on track. And some of the things in the red, that means we're going the wrong direction, and a few of them, at least with our recent trends, we're really going in the wrong direction. There's a lot more. I'll mention this later, but there's a lot more details in the report itself, state level summaries, all kinds of other cool stuff that you can kind of dig into. I'm just going to highlight a few of the different trends here just for fun. The bird indicator, so this is updated to the most recent breeding bird survey data, so going from 2014 to 2019. And I've kind of put our different ecosystem groups here, so the pine and prairie birds, the upland forest birds, and the forested wetland birds all together on one slide, because I feel like it's a pretty good way of looking at how we're doing in some of these different ecosystems. And so basically your dark green are high confidence increases, light green is kind of lower confidence increases. The lighter red is, declines, we're showing declines, but we have low confidence, and then the reds are high confidence declines. So in general, if you just, stepping yourself back up, looking across these systems, you can see, we're doing a lot worse in the pine and prairie side of things. We're kind of about even in upland forest, and we're doing pretty darn well for forested wetland birds right now. So there's always tweaks and exceptions. We go into that a little bit in the report, but holistically, when you step back, I think this tells a pretty solid picture of the places that we're doing a little bit better and the places where we are more behind. So salt marsh area, this was a new one for this year, kind of looking at trends. This is percent change per year in salt marsh area. So basically, as we're trying to balance and think about, okay, we know we're going to be losing salt marsh to sea level rise, and so how well are we doing helping it move, helping create, new salt marsh to make up for the stuff we're losing. And so this is, again, looking over that 2010 to 2016 period, and we had some pretty significant declines across pretty much every coastal state except for Mississippi and Louisiana. And so then talking to some of the folks, this is most likely due, there was a lot to basically the sort of hurricane response, and there was a significant amount of new salt marsh created during that time, especially around Louisiana and a few spots in the Gulf. Some recent storms have set that back, so it'll be really interesting to see what we see as we get some newer data on salt marsh. But in general, we are not keeping up with sea level rise with our salt marsh. We are losing more, at least over the most recent time period. And you get some similar trends as you go even farther back. So this is fairly interesting, and especially, one of the fun things we do with this is, since we have some numbers, we can start putting some of these trends in context compared to other states, compared to other regions, and things like that. So that's salt marsh. Working lands conservation. So this is actually what this is looking at is change in adoption of different conservation practices. So this is across all of USDA, summarized by these different states from 2015 to 2020. And what you can see is, with very few exceptions, we're seeing significant increases in adoption of some of these working lands practices, the conservation practices, which is pretty great. This is the first year we're digging into this part. This is one of the, just like salt marsh and some of the other stuff I mentioned, these are some common requests as people review the goal report. It's like, oh, I'd really love to see this. I'd really love to see something on working lands. This is our first cut on it, looking at some of these broader changes. There's a whole bunch of really cool information to dig into that we might be able to do next year on, really the types of conservation practices and other stuff. But this kind of gives you a sense of what's going on. A few of the more prominent things, the Caribbean doesn't really have that many working conservation practices from USDA on it, and pretty much almost that entire decline was due to one water quality related practice, because this is percent change. Also in the report, although I don't have it in the slides, we also have some numbers that look at, well, what percent of the state is private land in the first place, and of that private land, how much, what's that ratio of working land practices to available private land for the different states. So that's also in the summary to dive a little bit deeper. And Florida was pretty much flat. Sometimes it's hard to see this little blue line right here, but sometimes people sort of ask, hey, is Florida missing data? So we have data on all of them. It's just not, it's just missing there. So lots of cool stuff to dig into this. Some in the report now and some that we can play with in the future. And yeah, so that's just a highlight of a few things. Next steps are experimenting with some more detailed state summaries that might be able to try to get out kind of in between. So we release this at the end of the year, around the fall of every year, the goal report update. And we're looking into maybe, sometime, maybe spring or summer, trying to release some more detailed state summaries, because there's a lot of cool stuff we can dig into. Like I mentioned, looking at the longer term, more detailed trends and some things like, around birds, around conservation practices and other stuff. So that's something we're exploring. And then another thing coming from the points of contact for SECAS is we're going to dig a little bit into more detail on what's needed to stay on track for each indicator. So going beyond just kind of looking at the trends, especially now that the data is starting to catch up to the point where we set our goal. We're going to try to do a little bit more forward-looking things. The example I had of the sort of salt marsh area is one where it's like, okay, we're off track, but how many acres of salt marsh do we need to stay on track for that goal? And what do we need for bird trends to stay on track and stuff like that. So that's something we're going to dig into a little bit more into the future. All right, so that is the goal report stuff. I'm going to do something maybe we don't always do. Let me just stop there to see if there are any questions about the goal report stuff before I go into the blueprint things.
Sounds great. Yeah, feel free just to unmute yourself and speak up. You just click the little microphone button in your top menu or use the chat.
All right, I will keep moving. If you have something, you could always ask at the end. Just didn't want you to have to be like, oh, I gotta remember this question. We move on to something else. Okay, so let's talk about the 2021 Southeast Conservation Blueprint. So this has really been a stepping stone for bigger improvements. This is setting the stage for 2022, which we've talked about this larger base blueprint approach, where we're going to try to have the same kind of approach y'all are used to, at least in the South Atlantic, and cover the larger area of the Southeast. And so that's been a big part of our development, is like, okay, how do we re-engineer stuff? How do we get this more consistency across the whole Southeast? So that's a big thing we've been doing, not just behind the scenes, but in all the development we're doing, setting the stage for more consistency, which is something that y'all have asked for, being able to use the data more consistently across the Gulf, across a bunch of different states, that kind of thing. As far as this year's improvement, we made multiple improvements in the South Atlantic region, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And some of you have seen, we talked a little bit about the updates to the South Atlantic blueprint, and also fixed a scoring issue in the Middle Southeast. So there was an issue with how some of the numbers came through, and so we've also fixed that as part of this. Everything else does look the same. And for this year, the South Atlantic has also been a test area for bigger improvements. So things that we previously really just done in the South Atlantic, but are planning on doing across the larger Southeast. So I'm going to hit really quickly then, just talk about some of the South Atlantic improvements, just a few of these. We updated and improved a whole bunch of indicators, including basically trying to get them out as far as we could go so we could better capture the broader Southeast. Made a bunch of progress on better incorporation of equity, deep sea coral, fire, important grassland areas. Expect to continue a lot of that stuff into the future too. And made a bunch of cool connectivity related improvements. Y'all remember some of the voting we did as far as different approaches to connectivity, and also particularly exciting, which I'm not going to talk about so much here, but Amy did a whole series of blog posts on the really cool approach we've been taking to try to incorporate road crossings into the corridors. So we've got a few of them in now, but I think there's some really cool stuff we can do into the future of building the road crossings into the corridors. So there's a little bit in a few spots this year, and hoping for, fingers crossed, be able to do some more stuff for next year. What's changed and what hasn't? I think just like normally happens at this point, the broad patterns are similar, but we continue to improve some of the finer details just based on all the great reviews and stuff y'all are giving us, all the feedback. So we update data as the landscape's changing, and we try to fix stuff that have come out in the workshops. And so that's kind of what you see. You zoom way out, it's like, oh, this looks like the blueprint, but they're going to be, as usual, some finer details that we improve. And then I want to just hit on a few kind of related to those, a few of the indicator updates and things that we did this year. Updating our hard bottom and deep sea coral layer was a kind of a big deal. It was potential hard bottom condition. You can see to the left, it was really kind of focused on a lot more kind of known sites before, and folks wanted a lot more, had kept noticing, new places as we've gotten new kind of submersibles and new data, and wanted a better, more holistic way of capturing these important areas. And so now we have a much bigger and more inclusive way of looking at the hard bottom and deep sea coral, which is the indicator on the right, which is available now, bringing in two major different approaches from NOAA and TNC on how to approach this, and bringing in some updated data on where we've already seen coral and hard bottom. So that was very cool on the marine side of things. We also tweaked the methods to separate out two marine regions, which was a previous issue with folks. There was just too much priority near the coast. And so with folks that are working, in coastal waters, we get this feedback. It's like, I'd love to use the blueprint, but everything's a priority right on the coast and our state waters. So we have some new regions, and so that gives a little bit more prioritization to help people, particularly within state waters. So made a number of improvements there. We worked a lot on the marine region for this year, because last year we didn't do anything as far as major updates to that. So we wanted to give the marine area some love. In fact, I was just working on a marine user support thing this morning. And then also within the marine corridors, we managed to bring in marine mammal movement zones, which was another big request. People wanted to see some of the, we have a marine mammal indicator that looks at kind of some of these hot spots, but they wanted us to be able to bring, especially in the corridors, more of the kind of, what are these important migration areas for marine mammal species? So we're able to bring in and use some data this year in the corridors around right whale, humpback whale, and sperm whale. And I'm kind of pointing to, like, those are some of the important little corridors for each of them. It's a fun improvement. And so this is the corridors on top of how we do it. So generally the lighter gray is the potential areas the corridors can go through based on the movement zones. And then we run the corridors based on the blueprint priorities and what's the shortest path to go through as much blueprint priority as possible. And again, a few other things on the freshwater side. We've updated our migratory fish to be a little bit more broader and capture some areas that we're missing as far as important places from the previous data. We now are using Atlantic migratory fish habitat from the Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership. So that's another thing we try to do as much as possible. Lockstep, kind of sync the data layers and priority layers with existing partnerships. So, if you're part of the Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership, you can pull out very specifically, here's the work that's been done on migratory fish habitat. So that's another nice improvement on the freshwater side. And then another one on the terrestrial side, one of the improvements we've made in the past years, we've had the terrestrial resilient sites out of TNC looking at those climate resilient sites. We brought in the resilient coastal sites looking at the resilience of current salt marsh patches in previous blueprints. But this year we're able to basically connect the two. So in the process of doing those two, we had this North Carolina shows it in particular. There was kind of a salt marsh migration zone that was not included in the terrestrial resilience, but also wasn't currently salt marsh, but was that future connection between these terrestrial resilient sites and the coastal sites. And so we work with Mark and Emily and figure out the best way that we can incorporate a more seamless approach to prioritizing those. So now we're getting not just the resilience of the current salt marshes, but we're better addressing those wetland migration corridors where the salt marsh are going to need to go into the future, and where those most resilient paths for them to travel to up to these more terrestrial resilient sites. So that was nice. And there's more details in the changelog. This has actually been a common request too of folks. Actually on some web forums, I think maybe a year or two ago, we've had some folks, as we talk about the changes, say, hey, is there some kind of place I can go to see all the changes that happened, everything that changed or updated or things like that. And so now we've started doing these change logs. So if you want to see beyond just the quick highlights I give, if you want to know any of the changes or tweaks or things that happened, we now have this handy dandy change log that's part of all the blueprint data and things like that. And so this captures things that have changed. So all of these, this little empty slot 0 is like, okay, this is exactly the same as the previous one. We have minus where we've kind of removed or replaced something. So in this case, like this year, we took out our not as good previously burned pine habitat with much better fire frequency data from Southeast Fire Map. So out goes one, in goes another. We also have some changes. This is kind of like indicator change from a previous version. So these are things where we've improved or updated it based on data. So in some way, shape, or form, we've touched, almost all the indicators. Sometimes it's just wording, sometimes it's improvements, sometimes it's just there's new data, sometimes it's just improving the legend wording. So they've changed, sometimes it's a tiny change just to make it easier to use, and sometimes it's newer data or more significant improvements. Yeah, so there's more stuff in the change log on the gory details of what's changed. And yeah, everything in the South Atlantic is pretty much the major changes that are that happened in the Southeast Blueprint this year. But there's a lot more cool stuff in store for next year. And yeah, and the last thing I wanted to hit on was just talking about this symposium that happened at the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies meeting last month, I think. And so this was set up to talk more broadly about originally, when the symposium started, it was when this bigger initiative from the Biden administration about 30 by 30, conserving 30% of the country by 2030. And the whole 30 by 30 as a general idea has gotten a lot of interest in all kinds of other places globally, but in cities and states and other partnerships. But this one I think was more specific to this bigger initiative, which has now been rebranded to America the Beautiful. And so the symposium was really about getting a bunch of folks together and talking about, okay, here is this kind of big initiative. What do we want the relationship to SECAS to be? Seems like it could be a good opportunity, but let's talk about it and see, can we, how do we best use and connect, since there's a lot of things that are asked for in America the Beautiful that we're already doing. So that was the overall symposium. There was a pretty sweet list of plenary speakers from private industry, states, federal, NGOs, kind of everyone kind of gave their take on that early on. And then we did some breakout sessions of everyone that was part of the symposium, and really kind of talked about some of these questions about, what do you think the role of SECAS should be related to America the Beautiful? Here are some emerging themes that have come out of that. We're still cleaning up and getting some more formal stuff out here, but wanted to share just some emerging themes that came out of it. The first one is that there was general optimism across pretty much all the speakers and a lot of the comments to just seize the momentum created by this conservation initiative, this kind of quote unquote straight from the top conservation initiative. even more optimism than I think some of us expected as we were setting up the symposium, because we were trying to get a bunch of different voices and people that would be more of the like, speak to some skepticism about connections and all that. But overall, it was pretty general optimism on that. Another theme was really just using existing approaches and collaboratives. Don't try to do anything new, reinvent the wheel, create something new. Let's look to what we already have in the South and not try to do a new thing. Another thing related to that was focusing less on the numbers, the sort of 30% and definitions, and more on the conservation outcomes. You know, okay, let's really focus on getting the outcomes we need and tracking and making sure those happen. And then the last one was really highlighting the importance of locally led conservation efforts to really achieve those outcomes at a local scale, and then adding up to regional scale accomplishments. So highlighting that really we need the full stack of, we need to be able to add stuff up at the big regional scale, but we also really need to focus a lot on empowering some of the smaller local conservation efforts. So those are some emerging themes that came out of there. Next steps, we're still going to keep combing through the different comments and clean some things up. We'll refine some of those central themes and perspectives. And this is going to go to the SECAS, the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy Steering Committee, in December. And we'll be talking about recommendations for actions in 2022. So we'll look through all those, bring some stuff through the governance, through the points of contact, through all that, and then see what that means for 2022 for SECAS. Yeah, so that's a quick summary of what happened in the symposium. That is the end of my beautiful slide deck. And any questions on any of that?
Yeah, we have plenty of time, so feel free to unmute yourself by clicking your little microphone icon or drop a question in the chat and I'll share it.
Hillary, I have a question that I would just be kind of interested to ask for this kind of group is, from the crowd who's in here, is there anything, is there any kind of interest of an indicator for either the blueprint or the goal report that they would like to see that they're not currently seeing? I think I would just be kind of interested to see how all those indicators are resonating, or if there's any gaps we might be missing.
That's a great question. Anyone want to address that?
Those are always useful for scoping. We've, like I think I mentioned before, the three new indicators we added to the goal report were specifically because people asked for them. And I scoped them out and was like, oh, okay, we can actually do this. Sometimes, yeah, you might ask for it, we might not be able to do it just with existing data, but don't worry about that. Just
Ruick can worry about that.
Don't worry about that. We'll figure that out.
I do like it when Ruick worries about all those things. I like just having the ideas. But I was just kind of curious, like how it all kind of resonated with people, if they've seen it for the first time today, or if they've been following along.
Maybe while y'all noodle on that, there is a question in the chat from Gillian B. Are there other efforts similar to the goal report being done in other regions of the U.S.? Yeah,
so I've actually been, there are some of those that from kind of, it was modeled off of what you see from some of the National Estuarine Partnerships and the Chesapeake Bay and other groups that do some of these similar kind of regular updated goal reports. As far as across like big regions and like we've been doing in SECAS, there's a lot of interest in some of the other regional partnerships of doing some similar things to going along a similar track. So I've been talking with folks in the Northeast, the Midwest. I was just talking with some folks out and talking with folks in Alaska, and some folks out west about very much that topic, setting, a holistic collaborative goal for a bigger region and then tracking it kind of every year, specifically because I think there's some great opportunities for us to collaborate. I mean, some of these things are national data sets. Maybe some of the species or some of the things are different, but sometimes they're just a regional slice off the same data set, like the conservation practices or, other components. So I've been talking with folks and having conversations to see if we can, not just both be doing goal reports like this, but also can we, share approaches? Can we kind of divide and conquer and take on different pieces? Can we work on display stuff just to kind of make everyone's products more usable? And if you're cutting across boundaries, if you could see the goal report that I was showing, and it would look similar or have some different similar components as what you saw in the Midwest or in the Northeast or out in Alaska, that kind of thing. So I've been having discussions. There's a lot of interest of folks moving forward in the next year or so to kind of do something similar, and then and also working on it together so everyone can kind of benefit.
And Gillian, since you're here, did you want to comment on the Tennessee River Basin report card or your plans for that? I mean, that's obviously within the Southeast, but if that's something that other folks on the call aren't aware of, might be interested to hear more about the plans for that if you're going to update or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep, we got you.
So our report card thing is just kind of on hold just due to capacity funding, but I think it's very similar to what the Chesapeake Bay, that partnership was producing using the same PIs, but I feel like it's not as holistic as the SECAS goals, which is really neat. We're kind of more targeted on just aquatic, but
sure.
Yeah, so right now it's just kind of on hold. We're hopeful that maybe we'll be able to improve it in the future, but.
Great, thanks.
And maybe we can work together on, for stuff that's just summaries in the Tennessee Basin, or just taking some of the ideas from the Tennessee Basin report card and fold it into the Southeast report. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, it would be neat to explore how we can align those a little bit better. Or even take off, we do some state by state breakdowns in the goal report of like, here's how a particular indicator is scoring state by state. And we could maybe even explore looking at how, the Tennessee River Basin's contribution to some of the metrics in the SECAS goal report and sort of scale that down. Could be a cool thing to look at.
We can do that. I think that's, makes everyone's job easier. And we do actually, on the goal report side of things, that does help focus some of the efforts around SECAS, or when we get some requests from national efforts, or like kind of national initiatives on where things need to focus. The goals, really do sort of point to some places where we're doing better and where we're doing worse. And that helps at a bigger level of like, okay, do we need to focus in, all things being equal, where do we need the most attention in the Southeast? Do we need more pushes in uplands and grasslands or in salt marsh versus other places? So it does help inform some of those decisions.
Now I thought I saw Alexander stick his hand up and then stick it back down, and it might have been what I do all the time where I just click the hand and I didn't mean to, but if you did have a question, please feel free to jump in.
No, Hillary, I was just going to let Louise come in with her question, so I figured I'd take it down and let that conversation unfold. But I did have a question for you, Rua, and for you, Hillary, and this might be a little bit more of a user support question, but you gave us a really good explanation, description of how the data changes and how you notify potential users and stakeholders of the improvements in the data and that the results might change. I'm just kind of curious how those conversations go, or how you approach those conversations when the results do change and a potential user or stakeholder sees that their area either wasn't high value and now is, or was high value and no longer is. Kind of what their response is and how you kind of still maintain trust with the decision support tool while also recognizing their needs moving forward. Does that kind of summarize it well?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. We were actually just wrestling with this in a use case that we were working on with the town of Sandy Springs in Georgia. The one thing I'll mention off the bat, and Rua, please add on to this, generally we find that the priorities aren't massively changing from version to version. It's just more of a refinement. So we aren't often faced with like, oh, this super important river corridor was a high priority in the previous blueprint. Now it's completely disappeared. Like when we're reviewing the draft priorities, we're trying to make sure that those big themes that are caught in the review and through the workshops, major changes aren't happening and sort of jerking the rug out from under people who are trying to do conservation action in a particular area. But often, when we notice a difference like that working with the user, we kind of have to get into the data and investigate, like, is this an improvement? Is it that this was maybe over prioritized in the past version and now we've dialed it in and it's maybe a little bit better matching on the ground conditions? Was there a big change that happened in that area? A big habitat core got broken up by a big development and that explains why this has happened? Or did we make some change in the data that had like an unexpected negative effect on the blueprint, and it shouldn't have dropped in priority, for example. So we kind of have to dig into the data and try to get to the bottom of what really happened, and then really just work with the user to kind of communicate what's changed and why, and get their feedback too on how they feel about that change. Does that make sense to them? Are they comfortable with it? So that's kind of my initial take at that question, but Rua or Louise, please feel free to chime in.
I was actually just thinking about one area that I can remember around the Alligator River Peninsula in eastern North Carolina, where when we originally started with a data-driven prioritization, like the entire peninsula was considered like the highest priority, and even the people working there were like, that's weird, like that's great, but like what about all these ditching and the things that we're actively managing for? And so as we refined and got better, it did not drop out of priority, but it did start to actually do a better job of assessing true on-the-ground conditions. And I think that actually built trust, because they were like, yes, this is actually more of an accurate portrayal of the things that we're trying to do here, and it makes more sense in this way. And so because the data tends to get better and better and more recent, and we try to make the improvements, it tends to be, just as Hillary said, a refinement that's actually improves the accuracy of it, that resonates more with people. And I think that goes a longer way to building trust. And also, when we work with people and we see like their on the ground conditions that are not being accurately reflected, they haven't been put in the blueprint, it's Hillary and I's job and all of user support to really advocate for those users and to kind of beat the band with the GIS team and to talk about improvements. And we kind of pull them along, and so we can go back and say, like, now we have this accurate representation of your landscape, and now you're getting the recognition that you kind of deserve in the blueprint. And that's a big benefit. And I think that goes a far way to building trust. It's a benefit for us because there is no such thing as a perfect data or perfect analysis. And so without people kind of saying, this isn't right, put more effort here, we would have a lot less of a product without people kind of helping us to review it and like drawing on their expertise.
Yeah, and it is a hard, because there's so many different, so many different resources and such a big area that, the specific blueprint uses combined with all the feedback we get in the workshops where people really dig in and look at very specific places and tell us like, this should be this should be higher, this should be lower. I find that there's like a lot of no-brainer things that don't change. No matter what you do, no matter how you tweak your methods, it's just like, yes, of course. And there are some really tricky types of places that either just don't get captured well with existing data or are just complicated. And I think some of the ones that have been more complicated have been like around urban areas, right? Where it's just a complicated mix of different things. And so they can be sensitive to small different changes. And I think we've got a whole set based on just historic reviews and blueprint uses and workshop reviews of some of those places that are like, ooh, these are tricky ones. These are going to be sensitive to how we do things. And we try to keep an eye on those places that we know of, specifically to fix things. If we find an issue like in Sandy Springs and we know like, okay, we know what we need to work for, when we test stuff, we go back to those places and we're just like, okay, is this behaving better? But it's also the other way around. We look at tricky places that were captured well in a previous blueprint that we want to just make sure they stay that way at the same time. So yeah, we do functionally from the kind of back end side of things, we try to keep an eye on all these different places. And this is why like all the review and feedback everyone gives as a user, but also in the workshop is so just critical because it helps us know the spots to really pay close attention to when we're testing stuff.
And I'm sure this is a longer answer than you wanted, but a particular place where we were exploring this concept was through the corridors, and that's why we were asking for feedback on that. That's a aspect of the blueprint that's just really more sensitive to this sort of thing, because let's say that if you're conserving a place based on where the indicators score highly, if you only get part of a patch that scores highly on an indicator, well, you've still contributed. But if you only get part of a corridor and the whole point of conserving that area is to connect across two hubs, it's really not doing its job. You kind of have to have the whole thing if you want the corridor to function. So that was a place where we were really trying to make sure that the corridors, based on the feedback that we got from the workshops, people wanted the corridors to change based on landscape conditions and still be hooked into the blueprint priorities, but they didn't want the corridors massively changing and jumping around. So that, for example, if there was a local partnership that really wanted to implement a corridor and was hitting the ground running on land acquisition, they don't want to turn around and see that corridor disappear and then 2 years from now be like, why was I even working on this? It's not even in the blueprint anymore. So we heard that feedback loud and clear and are trying to get a handle on that with the corridors part of the blueprint.
Yep. That's the idea of the hybrid balance, like, okay, here's an area where it's going to stay a corridor somewhere, but you can still move around if development happens, if, a big hospital gets built near a place that you're going to need significant fire, the corridor can still shift a little bit, but holistically stays more stable over time. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, y'all. That was a great answer. So, Hillary, please don't apologize for that long response. It was really helpful. Just, when you add new data and change your methods and it changes the inference, it's something I've always struggled with. And how do you communicate and keep stakeholders engaged around that? So I just really appreciate the insight you all provided. So thank you.
It's a great question. One we're eager to talk about, apparently. Anybody else want to jump in? Does anybody have feedback to Louise's question about what parts of the indicators in the goal report or the blueprint resonated with you, or gaps that you see that you'd like to suggest something to fill it? I'm working on building up my awkward silence muscle, so thank you for helping me practice waiting longer for questions.
Where's my bicep emoji for that?
It's so hard for me. It's so hard.
Yeah. Well, I think in the future, since everyone's so quiet today, I think maybe in the future we'll just do we'll have a poll queued up for something like that for that. I think we had a little extra time, so
yeah, good idea. All right, well, don't be shy about dropping things in the chat or interrupting me. I'm just going to close out here with a quick summary of what to expect from our next webinar. Like I said, Rua hit the highlights of staff updates that we wanted to share today. So we always skip the December 3rd Thursday web forum for the holidays because it's usually right around that holiday time. So our next webinar is going to be in the new year. Oh, and I didn't change the date. I got to do that. That'll drive me nuts. 2022. So that'll be January 20th, 2022, third Thursday of January, and we're still ironing out the details with the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture Team, but the plan is to hear from their science coordinator, Mo Carell, about their black rail modeling that they've been working on. They have 2 black rail models that they're working on. One is a species distribution model that's intended to identify priority tidal areas for black rails. And then they also have a wetland creation planning tool that they're working on that will help target places where restoration or creation of new wetlands might be needed in non-tidal areas. So I'm really excited to learn more about that. And this is something that we've been talking about trying to get incorporated into the blueprint in some way as an indicator of marsh habitat. So definitely looking forward to this webinar, and there'll be a lot more detail in the reminder email for the web forum that'll go out once we get into the new year. So stay tuned for that. And then lastly, I always close on this slide. If you want that reminder email for this web forum series, please do join the South Atlantic web community. Just go to southatlanticlcc.org and create an account, and that'll get you signed up for our monthly newsletter and that webinar reminder email. We're also running a newsletter for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, which you can subscribe to at secassoutheast.org. And you can sign up for that newsletter on the footer of any page of the SECAS website just by visiting that URL there. We are working on streamlining these down to one newsletter. That's going to hopefully happen in this next year as we build toward this Southeast Blueprint approach. And if you're subscribed to the South Atlantic newsletter, you probably saw a blog in there that just went out yesterday about how we're sort of navigating these changes, moving to one seamless Southeast Blueprint and kind of the implications that has for the South Atlantic and a lot of our resources. You're obviously always welcome to connect with your Blueprint staff and then explore the Conservation Blueprint online. We'd love to hear how it's working for you. If we can help with a decision or a proposal, we're here to support you. That's what user support is all about. So with that, I will just pause again for questions and see whether anyone has questions or comments that have occurred to them. All right, well, if not, we'll go ahead and close things out for the day. Enjoy the remaining 12 minutes in your hour before your next call. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have an awesome holiday season. We will see you all in January.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Rua. Great talk.